I've been an employment lawyer for many companies over the years, and one thing I've come to learn is that many employees, including senior level managers and executives, don't understand even the basics of how their 401k plans work. So if you're just starting out in the world and the 401k thing is really confusing to you, don't feel bad. You're in very good company. Today I'm going to talk about the fundamentals of standard 401k plans and try to make it, crystal clear. And I'll use real numbers to help illustrate, how some of these concepts play out in real life. First, the question is, what is a 401k plan? So quite simply, it's a retirement plan sponsored by employers that offer certain tax and other financial benefits to the employees. And here's how it works. As an employee, you can contribute a portion of your paycheck, every week or every other week, however often you get paid, into the company's 401k plan. Let's say you make a base salary of $104,000 per year. And I'm picking that number just because it makes the calculations easy as we kind of go through this. So if you get paid every other week, that means, bi-weekly, in your paycheck, you're going to get $104,000 divided by 26, payments during the course of the year, or $4,000. So let's say of that $4,000, you want to contribute $500 per pay period to your 401k plan investment. So then you go into your account online and you kind of set the regular deduction at $500 and it just automatically comes out of your paycheck. Now, you can change that whenever you want. You can raise it, you can decrease it, or you can not contribute anything if you want. But most people just kind of set it at whatever amount they want and they just kind of forget about it and then just comes out automatically. So you'll see on your pay stub, if it's $500 contribution, you'll see that of the $4,000 on your pay stub, $500 goes into the 401k, and the balance, or $3,500, is what's left. So what I've just described is just a traditional 401k investment. And that means that the money you contribute to the 401k is pre-taxed. In other words, it's not taxed at the time of payment. The whole $500 goes into the 401k untaxed. And then the remaining $3,500 is subject to taxes and other withholdings. So you're not going to get $3,500 in your bank account. That's not what the employer is going to directly deposit. It's going to be $3,500 minus the taxes and other deductions. As an example, let's assume that your tax withholdings on payday comes to 25% of your earnings. That means of the $3,500 you have left after you contribute the $500 to the 401k, your employer will deposit into your checking account, that's like your money, 75% of the $3,500, or $2,625. And the $875, or the 25% of the $3,500, that goes to taxes. So here's the important point to understand, and that is the $500 that you contributed to your 401k, that's not tax-free. You do get taxed, it's just tax deferred. So in other words, you don't pay taxes on that money at the time of your payday, but most often it's much later on when you're retired and you withdraw money from your 401k. So there are two main advantages to having your taxes deferred. First of all, by deferring the taxes, more money goes into your 401k account at the outset. So there's more money for the increases in the investment, all the gains. Over time, investments typically make money for you. So there's just more money there to have those gains work for you over those many years. That's number one. And the second advantage of tax deferral is, presumably when you retire, you're going to be in a much lower tax bracket than you're likely to be when you're in your prime earning years, like when you're actually making the money. So in the end, because you're going to be taxed on that money in a lower tax bracket, you're actually going to be paying less taxes on it. So that's another big advantage of the deferral. What I just described is the scenario for a traditional 401k. But these days, about 90% of employer-sponsored retirement plans, 401k plans, now offer an alternative to the traditional 401k, and that is the Roth 401k. So the big difference is that with the Roth 401k, you're investing after-tax dollars. In other words, you're using a portion of what's left after the tax deductions are taken out and using that to invest in your 401k. So using the example from above, if your biweekly paycheck overall is $4,000 and the amount of your tax withholdings is, say, 25%, then what you actually get after taxes that you see on your pay stub is $3,000. So then if you want to contribute, $500 to your 401k, what's left is $2,500 that you actually get deposited into your checking account versus $2,650. So, the amount you get in your paycheck is actually less. So that's something you got to kind of consider. But here's the big advantage of a Roth IRA. Once that money is in your account, you don't pay taxes on it, at the time of withdrawal. And as long as you meet certain timing and age requirements, you don't even pay taxes on the gains that it made, that accumulated, over time from the increased value of your investment, which is not the case with a traditional 401k. In that scenario, at the time of withdrawal, you pay taxes not just on the amount of your initial investment, but also on the gains paid. So whichever is better for you, really depends on a number of factors. But the most important factor that I think most people consider is, whether you think your tax rate is going to be higher at the time of withdrawal versus the time of your paycheck. Now, for most people, they're going to be in a lower tax bracket when they're retired. They're just going to be making less money. Some people, they're just making Social Security and whatever they withdraw from their 401k. But, if you're just starting out in the working world, you're probably going to be at a pretty low tax rate. So it might be to your advantage just to invest in a, traditional 401k because, in the end, maybe your tax bracket later on is going to be higher. But, in deciding whether you go with a traditional 401k or a Roth, there are a number of factors that you kind of need to think about. So it's probably a good idea to check in with a financial advisor. Now, one of the nice things about 401k plans is typically the employer makes sure that the plan administrator, which is usually a third party, big bank, they have free investment advisors available. Now, they're not going to give you advice on all your whole financial situation, but they definitely will advise you on your 401k contributions and investments. So that's a nice benefit of these plans. Next, I want to talk about probably the biggest financial benefit of contributing to your employer-sponsored 401k plan, and that's the employer match. That's where your employer will match up to some specified amount. It's usually a percentage of your annual salary, and they'll match whatever you contribute, and they'll put that on your behalf into your 401k account. They'll actually fund a portion of that. So employers typically match somewhere between 3 and 5% of the employee's annual compensation. And some go higher. Some will put a cap at 6% of their annual comp, and some go even more than that, the really generous employers. And the match will either be, dollar for dollar, 100% of what the employee contributes up to the cap, or some portion of that. So if it's a portion, it's typically 50%. So in that case, the employer will pay 50 cents on every dollar that the employee contributes, again, up to the cap. So if you'd like to understand sort of the mechanics of how these employer matches work and some of the details, you should check out this video that I posted a few days ago. It's called Employer 401k Match, Don't Leave Money on the Table. And that explains a lot of the details of these. One of the things I do explain in this video is how you can unintentionally, and without even knowing it, disqualify yourself from getting the full amount of the employer match in any particular year, which is really unfortunate because the employer match is just free money, and you should get every penny that your employer is willing to pay into your 401k on your behalf. So the next important question is, once your money is in the 401k plan, how is it invested? Well, the answer is that's really up to you. Most 401k plans, offer like a variety of investment funds that you can contribute to, and the conventional wisdom is you try to diversify as much as you can. On one end of the spectrum, they have like very aggressive investment funds where they're high risk, but you also have a higher potential for getting higher gains on your investment. And then of course they also have the more conservative funds where it's safer, but they're kind of like slower growth. And how aggressive you want to be really depends on sort of your risk tolerance, but also how many years left do you have before you retire. If you're closer to retirement age, I think most investment advisors would recommend that you kind of steer a little further away from the high risk, high growth funds, and more toward the more conservative ones. Because if there's a downturn in the market and you're investing in a lot of high risk funds, you're going to have less time to bounce back from a downturn. So again, if you're closer to retirement age, you're probably going to want to invest in things a little more conservative. Again, it's probably a good idea is for picking funds and just understanding sort of an investment strategy. It's good to check in with an investment advisor. And as I said, most plans have those available through their plan administrator free of charge. One thing I'll mention on the selection of funds, if you, for whatever reason, you don't pick them yourself, the plans typically have like a default where they just kind of put you in certain funds based on, usually it's based on what age bracket you fall in, and they'll put you in what's called a life cycle fund, or sometimes they're called target date funds, so that the lineup that you default into is really based on your age. So if you're in the 50 to 60 age bracket, the target date fund is going to be this lineup that is skewed a little bit more towards sort of conservative investments. And if you're in the 20 to 30, you're probably going to be in more like high growth, a little higher risk, but also just more aggressive investment funds. And I have to say the life cycle funds, the target date funds, those are not bad options. Some people they're just not into researching different funds. They're just not into investing. So if you go in one of those are usually geared pretty good and are going to put you in something that really fits generally with kind of where you are in your career progression. So the last item I want to cover is what happens with your 401k funds when you leave your employment with your employer. Well, there are typically four options. First, you can just leave your money in that plan with your former employer. They don't kick you out. As long as you are above some like really minimal amount of investment, you can stay in there for as long as you want. Another option is you just roll it over, all those funds, you roll it over into your new employer's 401k plan, or you can roll it over into a private IRA, with a bank. And the fourth option is you can just cash it out, take your money out. Now this typically is not a good idea because then you have to pay all these taxes and also early withdrawal penalty. So that's not usually recommended. Before we close, I just want to stress how important it is to take full advantage of your employer's 401k. Don't do what I did when I was starting out. I wasn't into finance or investments or any of that. Like for me, it was boring and it kind of stressed me out. And my attitude was kind of like, I can't even picture myself being around, like making it to the age of retirement. I also think I was brainwashed by the fact that like my first few years on Earth were during like the 1960s when, the vibe was like peace, love, rock and roll. Hey, who needs money anyway? It wasn't until I reached middle age when I started actually contributing to my employer's 401k plans. And, in retrospect, that was really, really stupid. What I should have done was just contribute a chunk of my paycheck, had it go into the 401k, and then just forget about it. Because the reality is, what you consider like the necessities of life, like how much money do you need just to like live, that shrinks or expands depending on how much money you have available. So if I just put a portion of my paycheck into the 401k, I wouldn't have noticed a difference in terms of how much money I had to spend day to day. And I would have had all that time for that money to, obviously invest and accumulate and, increase in value over those many, many years. And the reality is, chances are you are going to make it to retirement. And if you do, and I think you will, you're going to be really happy that you did that. I mean, you'd be crazy not to contribute at least up to the amount of the employer match. Again, that's just free money. So that's my thought on this. If this video was helpful to you, please do subscribe to my channel. I'm going to, put out more videos like this. So anyway, we'll see you next time. Thanks.